Part 2 of Ministry of Disturbance by H. Beam Piper. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Part 2. Why, they have a Republican government, sir. A very complicated setup. Really, it's a junk heap. When anything goes badly, they always build something new into the government, but they never abolish anything. They have a president, a premier, and an executive cabinet, and a tricameral legislature, and two complete and distinct judiciaries. The premier is always the presidential candidate getting the next highest number of votes. In the present instance, the president, who controls the planetary militia, is accusing the premier, who controls the police, of fraud in the election of the middle house of the legislature. Each is supported by the judiciary he controls. Practically every citizen belongs either to the militia or the police auxiliaries. I am looking forward to further reports from Amaterasu, he added dryly. I dare say they'll be interesting. Send them to me in full, and red star them, if you please, Prince Trawan. He went back to the reports. The Ministry of Science and Technology had sent up a lengthy one. The only trouble with it was that everything reported was duplication of work that had been done centuries before. Well, no. A Dr. Dandrick of the Physics Department of the Imperial University here in Asgard announced that a definite limit of accuracy in measuring the velocity of accelerated subnucleonic particles had been established, 16.06754333 times light speed. That seemed to be typical. The frontiers of science now were all decimal points. The Ministry of Education had a little to offer. Historical scholarship was still active at least. He was reading about a new trove of source material that had come to light on Uller from the 6th century atomic era when the door screen buzzed and flashed. He lit it, and his son Roderick appeared in it, with Snooks, the little red hound, squirming excitedly in the Crown Prince's arms. The dog began barking at once, and the boy called through the phone. "Good morning, Father. Are you busy?" "Oh, not at all." He pressed the release button. "Come on in." Immediately, the little hound leaped out of the princely arms and came dashing into the study and around the desk, jumping onto his lap. The boy followed more slowly, sitting down in the desk-side chair and drawing his foot up under him. Paul greeted Snooks first. People can wait, but for little dogs everything has to be right now, and rummaged in a drawer until he found some wafers, holding one for Snooks to nibble. Then he became aware that his son was wearing leather shorts and tall buskins. "Going out somewhere?" he asked, a trifle enviously. "Up in the mountains for a picnic. Olva's going along." And his tutor and his esquire and Olva's companion lady and a dozen Thorin riflemen, of course, and they'd be in continuous screen contact with the palace. "That ought to be a lot of fun. Did you get all your lessons done?" "Physics and math and galactography," Roderick told him. "And Professor Gulison's going to give me and Olva our history after lunch." They talked about lessons and about the picnic. Of course, Snooks was going on the picnic, too. It was evident, though, that Roderick had something else on his mind. After a while, he came out with it. "Father, you know I've been a little afraid lately," he said. "Well, tell me about it, son. It isn't anything about you and Olva, is it?" Rod was 14. The little Princess Olva, 13. They would be marriageable in 6 years. As far as anybody could tell, they were both quite happy about the marriage which had been arranged for them years ago. "Oh, no, nothing like that. But Olva's sister and a couple of others of Mother's ladies-in-waiting were to a psi medium, and the medium told them that there were going to be changes. Great and frightening changes was what she said." "She didn't specify?" "No, just that. Great and frightening changes. But the only change of that kind I can think of would be, well, something happening to you." Snooks, having eaten 3 wafers, was trying to lick his ear. He pushed the little dog back into his lap and pummeled him gently with his left hand. "You mustn't let mediums gabble worry you, son. These psi mediums have real powers, but they can't turn them off and on like a water tap. When they don't get anything, they don't like to admit it, and they invent things. Always generalities like that, never anything specific." "I know all that." The boy seemed offended, as though somebody were explaining that his mother hadn't really found him out in the rose garden. "But they talked about it to some of their friends, and it seemed that other mediums are saying the same thing. Father, do you remember when the Haval Valley reactor blew up? All over Odin the mediums had been talking about a terrible accident for a month before that happened." "I remember that." Harv Dorfley believed that somebody had been falsely informed that the Emperor would visit the plant that day. These great and frightening changes will probably turn out to be a new fad in abstract sculpture. Any change frightens most people. They talked more about mediums, and then about air cars and air car racing, and about the Emperor's Cup race that was to be flown in a month. The communication screen began flashing and buzzing, and after he had silenced it with the busy button for the third time, Roderick said that it was time for him to go, came around to gather up Snooks, and went out, saying that he'd be home in time for the banquet. The screen began to flash again as he went out. It was Prince Ganze, the Prime Minister. He looked as though he had a persistent low-level toothache, but that was his ordinary expression. "Sorry to bother your Majesty. It's about these chiefs of state. Count Godvan, the Chamberlain, appealed to me, and I feel I should ask your advice. It's the matter of precedence." "Well, we have a fixed rule on that. Which one arrived first?" "Why, the Ateon. But it seems King Randulf insists that he's entitled to precedence, or rather his Lord Marshal does. This Lord Koref insists that his king is not going to yield precedent to a commoner." "Then he can go home to Durandal." He felt himself growing angry. All the little angers of the morning were focusing on one spot. He forced the harshness out of his voice. "At a court function, somebody has to go first, and our rule is order of arrival at the palace. That rule was established to avoid violating the principle of equality to all civilized peoples and all planetary governments. We're not going to set it aside for the King of Durandal or anybody else." Prince Ganze nodded. Some of the toothache expression had gone out of his face now that he had been relieved of the decision. "Of course, Your Majesty." He brightened a little. "Do you think we might compromise? Alternate the precedence, I mean?" "Only if this first citizen Yago consents. If he does, it would be a good idea." "I'll talk to him, sir." The toothache expression came back. "Another thing, Your Majesty. They've both been invited to attend the plenary session this afternoon." "Well, no trouble there. They can enter by different doors and sit in visitors' boxes at opposite ends of the hall." "Well, sir, I wasn't thinking of precedence, but this is to be an elective session, new members to replace Prince Havali of Defense, deceased, and Count Frosk of Science and Technology, elevated to the bench. There seems to be some difference of opinion among some of the ministers and councilors. It's very possible that the session may degenerate into an outright controversy." "Horrible," Paul said seriously. "I think, though, that our distinguished guests will see that the Empire can survive difference of opinion and even outright controversy. But if you think it might have a bad effect, why not postpone the election?" "Well, it's been postponed 3 times already, sir." "Postpone it permanently. Advertise for bids on 2 robot ministers, Defense and Science and Technology. If they're a success, we can set up a project to design a robot emperor." The Prime Minister's face actually twitched and blanched at the blasphemy. "Your Majesty is joking," he said, as though he wanted to be reassured on the point. "Unfortunately, I am. If my job could be robotized, maybe I could take my wife and son and our little dog and go fishing for a while. But, of course, he couldn't. There were only two alternatives, the Empire or galactic anarchy. The galaxy was too big to hold general elections, and there had to be a supreme ruler and a positive and automatic, which meant hereditary, means of succession. Whose opinion seems to differ from whose, and about what? He asked. Well, Count Douglas and Count Thompson want to have the Ministry of Science and Technology abolished, and its functions and personnel distributed. Count Douglas means to take over the technological sections under economics, and Count Thompson will take over the science part under education. The proposal is going to be introduced at this session by Count Guilfred, the Minister of Health and Sanity. He hopes to get some of the bio and psychoscience sections for his own ministry. That's right. Douglas gets the hide, Thompson gets the head and horns, and everybody who hunts with them gets a cut of the meat. That's good, sound law of the chase. I'm not in favor of it myself. Prince Ganze, at this session, I wish you'd get Captain General Dorfley nominated for the bench. I feel that it is about time to honor him with elevation. General Dorfley? But why, Your Majesty? Great galaxy, do you have to ask? Why, it's because the man's a raving lunatic. He oughtn't even to be trusted with a sidearm, let alone 5 companies of armed soldiers. Do you know what he told me this morning? That somebody is training a Nilhogg swamp crawler to crawl up the Octagon Tower and bite you at breakfast, I suppose. But hasn't that been going on for quite a while, sir? It was a gimmick in one of the cooking robots, but that's aside from the question. He's finally named the mastermind behind all these nightmares of his, and who do you think it is? Yarn Travan. The Prime Minister's face grew graver than usual. Well, it was something to look grave about. Some of these days. Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly agree more about the General's mental condition. But I really should say that, crazy or not, he is not alone in his suspicions of Prince Travan. If sharing them makes me a lunatic too, so be it, but share them I do. Paul felt his eyebrows lift in surprise. That's quite too much and too little, Prince Ganze, he said. Oh, with your permission, I'll elaborate. Don't think that I suspect Prince Travan of any childish prank with elevators or view-screens or cooking robots, the Prime Minister hastened to disclaim. But I definitely do suspect him of treasonous ambitions. I suppose Your Majesty knows that he is the first Minister of Security in centuries who has assumed personal control of both the planetary and municipal police instead of delegating his ex officio powers. Your Majesty may not know, however, of some of the peculiar uses he has been making of those authorities. Does Your Majesty know that he has recruited the security guard up to at least 10 times the strength needed to meet any conceivable peace maintenance problem on this planet, and that he has been piling up huge quantities of heavy combat equipment, guns up to 200 millimeter, heavy contragravity, even gun cutters and bomb and rocket boats? And does Your Majesty know that most of this armament is massed within 15 minutes flight time of this palace? Or that Prince Travan has at his disposal from 2.5 to 3 times in men and firepower the combined strength of the planetary militia and the Imperial Army on this planet? I know. It has my approval. He's trying to salvage some of the young non-workers through exposing them to military discipline. A good many of them, I believe, have gone off-planet on their discharge from the SG and hired as mercenaries, which is a far better profession than vote-selling. Quite a plausible explanation. Prince Travan is nothing if not plausible, the Prime Minister agreed. And does your Majesty know that, because of repeated demands for support from the Ministry of Security, the Imperial Navy has been scattered all over the Empire, and that there is not a naval craft bigger than a scout boat within 1,500 light years of Odin? That was absolutely true. Paul could only nod agreement. Prince Ganze continued. He has been doing some peculiar things as police chief of Asgard, too. For instance, there are two powerful non-workers voting bloc bosses, Big Moogie Blisco and Zicko the Nose. I assure your Majesty that I am not inventing these names. That's what the persons are actually called, who have been enjoying the favor and support of Prince Trevan. On a number of occasions, their smaller rivals, leaders of less important gangs, have been arrested, often on trumped-up charges, and held incommunicado until either Moogie or Zicko could move into their territories and annex their non-worker followers. These two block bosses are subsidized, respectfully, by the steel and shipbuilding cartels and by the reaction products and chemical cartels, but actually they are controlled by Prince Trevan. They in turn control between them about 70% of the non-workers in Asgard. And you think this adds up to a plot against the throne? A plot to seize the throne, your Majesty. Oh, come, Prince Ganze, you're talking like Dorfley. Hear me out, your Majesty. His Imperial Highness is 14 years old. It will be 11 years before he will be legally able to assume the powers of Emperor. In the dreadful event of your immediate death, it would mean a regency for that long. Of course, your ministers and counselors would be the ones to name the regent, but I know how they would vote with security bayonets at their throats, and regency might not be the limit of Prince Trevan's ambitions. In your own words, quite plausible, Prince Ganze. It rests, however, on a very questionable foundation. The assumption that Prince Trevan is stupid enough to want the throne. He had to terminate the conversation himself and blank the screen. Victor Ganze was still staring at him in shocked incredulity when his image vanished. Victor Ganze could not imagine anybody not wanting the throne, not even the man who had to sit on it. He sat for a while looking at the darkened screen, a little worried. Victor Ganze had a much better intelligence service than he had believed. He wondered how much Ganze had found out that he hadn't mentioned. Then he went back to the reports. He had gotten down to the Ministry of Fine Arts when the communications screen began calling attention to itself again. When he flipped the switch, a woman smiled out of it at him. Her blonde hair was rumpled, and she wore a dressing gown. Her smile brightened as his face appeared in her screen. "Hi," she greeted him. "Hi yourself. You just get up?" She raised a hand to cover a yawn. "I'll bet you've been up raining for hours. Were Rod and Snooks in to see you yet?" He nodded. "They just left. Rod's going on a picnic with Olva in the mountains." How long had it been since he and Morris had been on a picnic, a real picnic, with less than 50 guards and as many courtiers along? "Do you have much raining to do this afternoon?" She grimaced. "Flower festivals. I have to make personal tri-D appearances live with messages for the loving subjects. 3 minutes on and a 2-minute break between. I have 40 this afternoon." "Ugh. Well, have a good time, sweetheart. All I have is lunch with the bench and then this plenary session." He told her about Ganze's fear of outright controversy. "Oh, fun. Maybe somebody'll pull somebody's whiskers or something. I'm in on that, too." The call indicator in front of him began glowing with the code symbol of the Minister of Security. "We can always hope, can't we? Well, Yorn Trevan's trying to get me now. Don't keep him waiting. Maybe I can see you before the session." She made a kissing motion with her lips at him and blanked the screen. He flipped the switch again, and Prince Trevan was on the screen. The security minister didn't waste time being sorry to bother him. End of Part 2.